save me spots.
Wow. You can see better than me. I figured that was that's really what it was about. At first I thought you think maybe I'm tall or something. Nah, it's just that you want to be able to see better.
You can probably see over me.
How's it work? Is it just this falling side as it would put as it sets up the big side? I mean, you have to put the stone
Yeah, mid to bottom. Preheated for almost an hour. 550 degrees. Yeah, max. And then use the heat.
then when you're done doing that, you just keep it here. Keep it there.
It's just like
When is she due to be in that position?
I prefer if they have it like a larger square versus the small large square. Rectangle.
But then I have to measure carefully the size of the so when is she due to be in this loop? So when is so you might want to start doing your work now.
So I might start wanting looking at taking some classes for public health, maybe.
Yeah, and just reconnecting. Oh, good, good, good.
I sent her an email, and she called me today when I was working on. She called me around noon. She said, "Look, I'm on my way to a meeting. I'll call you tonight." I thought she was going to call me at 8 o'clock.
Sounds difficult, good.
When I was a candidate for
There's also a kitchen store.
job at a school in Rowan Valley, she just said that you apply for a job.
But it's like, it used to be a
Candidate, and they ended up offering the job.
there's something that's
My job.
something about housing better. Confident in you almost lined up. I didn't really have lunch either, and I'm hungry now.
High rise.
So again, I should go early in the morning. Like,
I could actually
yeah, okay. So they're finish it. Like, can you take me some? I feel like they're too late. Then there's nothing.
Yeah, there might not be a practice. I don't know.
Yeah.
I had no idea it was up there.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I know.
Well, welcome. I'm Alex Jones. I'm director of the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy. I'm very, very glad to welcome you all here tonight to this conversation with Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein about the issue of anonymous sources and some of the implications of those creatures that have been so much in the news for such a long time. I want to say how much I appreciate both of you coming in this cold weather, and we're very glad to have you here. In June of 1972, Bob Woodward was 29 years old. He'd been at the Washington Post for less than a year. Carl Bernstein had been there longer, but was younger. And they were Metro reporters. They were reporters who had lots of ambition, lots of energy, lots of drive, but were not in what was considered one of the prestige beats. They got a call about a burglary, a third-rate burglary, if I might say so, that turned into something much, much bigger, as you all know. I think it's interesting to note that Bob Woodward had 2 years earlier accepted an invitation to come to Harvard Law School and had changed his mind. Right before we came out, I asked Carl Bernstein whether anything might have been different if Bob Woodward had taken that appointment at Harvard Law School instead of changing his mind and becoming a journalist. And Carl declined to speculate.
He's still being torched.
He might be actually a federal prosecutor looking for unnamed sources and finding people out.
I hope not.
There's a certain relentlessness to that kind of a nature. There's a certain repertorial quality as well. Anyway, they are, I think, as you would agree, the most celebrated and admired reporting team in history. The Washington Post won a Pulitzer Prize for public service, which is the most important and most honored Pulitzer Prize that was and it was done on the basis of their reporting largely. They did 2 #1 best-selling books, All the President's Men and The Final Days. They had the pleasure of being portrayed by Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman in the movies. Carl Bernstein left the Washington Post a few years later. He's been at ABC, Time, Vanity Fair. He's written books of his own. Bob Woodward has written many, many books as well. He stayed at the Washington Post and is now an assistant managing editor there. His books are ones in which there is a strong narrative, an omniscient voice that is based on an enormous amount of reporting, but they are not analytical. They are more repertorial, and they tell a story that is essentially allowed to represent itself and stand for itself. It is a story that he vouches for based on his reporting. The 2 books that he has written on the George W. Bush administration are Bush at War and Plan of Attack. Plan of Attack was published in 2004. We'll get back to those later in the evening. I want to start, though, with the fact that they have kept, and they did keep, a secret for over 30 years, and that was the identity of their key source, or one of their key sources certainly, the one that certainly got the most attention, the one who is known as Deep Throat. One of the things that I did not know until I was preparing for this evening was that Nixon and Haldeman knew who Deep Throat was, not by that name, of course, but knew that Mark Felt, the #2 man in the FBI, was a critical source for you guys just months after Watergate, and basically decided not to confront him out of fear that he would go public and be even more damaging than he might have been as a
what
source.
is said on the tapes, I think, is significant. Haldeman says, well, Felt knows everything, and he could go on network television, and that just caused them to literally do nothing.
Yeah, I think it was fascinating to learn that. The big story that began this evening was the revelation earlier this year that Mark Felt was, in fact, Deep Throat. The identity was intended to be kept a secret until his death. But an article in Vanity Fair magazine that had been authorized by his lawyer and his daughter essentially told the story and Woodward and Bernstein confirmed the identity. Tonight, we're going to talk about anonymous sources. We're going to talk about Mark Felt, but we're especially going to talk about the ethical questions and quandaries that are represented by dealing with anonymous sources, something that you guys know so very well. Carl Bernstein said in his Vanity Fair article about the decision to confirm Mark Felt, "To be absolutely clear, there is no way our reporting on Watergate could have been done without the use of anonymous sources. In fact, in our first 100 stories, there is not a single named source who revealed anything of substance about the undercover activities of the Nixon White House." I think that your 30-year silence on the identity of Deep Throat indicates your commitment to keeping the promise of confidentiality. Bob Woodward, let me ask you, can you imagine a situation in which you would give up an anonymous source, promise confidentiality against his wishes?
No, I cannot. I mean, I think it's an absolute contract, and particularly in the current atmosphere of war, a secretive administration, lots of things being hidden, those sources are our lifeline. And if they feel nervous, or future sources, people out there thinking, you know, maybe I want to call Bernstein or somebody and give them something that might be critical, if the environment is one of, gee, there's a risk, they won't do it.
Well, I know that in your article in Vanity Fair, you talked about the way you struggled through the decision to confirm Mark Felt. The argument being that you had promised Mark Felt that you would not identify him as a source until he was dead. You apparently had approached Mark a few times to try to get him to change his mind, perhaps. He had refused. And now, when he was in a situation, a state of mind that was muddled and I think seemed to be clearly not entirely compos mentis, you were very nervous about whether you should honor your commitment under these circumstances. Why did you change your mind? Do you have second thoughts today about whether you should, as you described, simply have said, we're not going to say anything, it'll be just another theory?
Well, that day, though Carl is a contributing editor to Vanity Fair, you had no clue
Neither of us had
that
any
they were
idea they were doing this.
And then we were faxed that story in the morning, and you came down to Washington, and we had some very serious debates between us and with the current editor of the Post, Len Downey, and Ben Bradley, our editor on Watergate, about what to do. And our first inclination was...
No, absolutely not. If the Post wants to do it, you know, they're out there on their own, but we're not going to confirm it. That was our first response. By the end of the day, we confirmed it at 5 o'clock. It was apparent to us that we would have no credibility were we not to confirm it, because it was obviously the truth. It was obviously coming through the family, through the family's representatives. And I must say, to this day, I think it's a sad situation, because I don't know how much Mark Felt participated in that decision. Let me say one other thing, though, in that Vanity Fair article that I wrote, which is also about the Bush administration very much. But I said, does every source deserve a reporter's protection, regardless of how unsavory or even criminal? Absolutely, as long as the source has kept his part of the bargain and dealt faithfully and honestly with the reporter, even Karl Rove. This was before the special prosecutor had issued any indictments. But that's the point. You know, during Watergate, our sources, for the most part, were not necessarily all the good guys.
I take your point, and I think that most journalists understand that most of the time when people give you sensitive and confidential information, it is not because necessarily they're good citizens, it's because they have an axe to grind, certainly a point of view that they're trying to advance.
But that's why you then have an obligation to go elsewhere to confirm what they're telling you.
But I think that this whole issue of anonymous sources has started a whole series of conversations about what ifs and how far you go. Because, for instance, in this particular case that you're talking about, the Valerie Plame case, what seemed to be happening was that this was a concerted effort, not instigated by reporters who were seeking information, but was certainly projected. Basically, people had relationships, and the fact was that this information was sort of coming over the transom.
Yeah, yes, but the right word you used is seemed, and we don't know at this point.
But would that make a difference?
But you know what, and I just kind of want to emphasize as a launching point for the discussion of this. This really is an unbreakable contract unless somebody is dishonest with you.
Right.
If somebody lies to you, then you go back and say, you broke the bargain. But the issue here is, in the last two books I've done about Bush, there is descriptions of sensitive intelligence, top secret code word intelligence going to the president, covert action findings for the war on terror, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, top secret war planning, to get people to give you information like that, which I think is vital to understanding so people can really see what's going on, you have to make that pledge. And that pledge, it doesn't have any ifs or speculation attached to it.
Okay, what about hypothetically? And I think this is a fair hypothetical. What if not revealing a source was going to send an innocent person to prison?
I think you would try to find a way to keep that person out of prison. But I think, all
go
these
beg
years,
the source.
that's
You
right.
go
You do
on your
everything
knees.
and everything you can to keep that person out of prison. And all these hypothetical discussions that we've had for years and years and years in seminars and all the rest, almost none of them ever come to pass. I think we got to.
Okay,
We're talking about real time.
Except the begging part.
Right, but we're talking about real time
we beg.
journalism here.
Okay,
Real time
then
reporting.
But then the answer is, except for extreme situations, you protect the source.
But you'll
No.
still protect it. Look, if some innocent person is going to go to jail, and you have a source, presumably the source maybe is the person who committed the crime. Is that what you're suggesting?
Hypothetically. It could be any number of
Then you
circumstances.
go and you do the things reporters do, and you say, and hopefully you're dealing with the source who has got a heart and a head, and say, look, somebody's going to go to jail. We have to find some way to get this information out. And I think the ingenuity, if I couldn't figure it out, I'd call Carl, and you'd find some way to do it.
The problem is heart and a head in Washington. That's the problem.
That's why I'd call you.
That's right.
You talk about how they came after you, the Nixon administration came after you with subpoenas. And you were told to leave for the afternoon, Carl, and went to see the movie Deep Throat. So
That's
you
what
know
I did.
exactly what you were talking about as far as.
But while I was gone, Mrs. Graham took possession of our notes, and she was also subpoenaed. And so therefore, as Ben Bradley said, when I got back, well, that's going to make some picture on the front page when our gal is down at the detention center in her limousine getting out.
Well, I mean,
and
He literally said, see that picture on the front page of every newspaper in the
That's
world
right, it's our gal.
of Katharine Graham's limousine pulling up to the D.C. jail, and she's getting out with a box
Right,
of
with our notes.
Let me ask you
to
something. If
uphold
Patrick
the principle.
Fitzgerald had been in charge of that,
But that was a civil case
I know,
where they
but
were.
I'm just saying, if you had a Patrick Fitzgerald, I don't think Patrick Fitzgerald would have hesitated to send Mrs. Graham to prison for a split second. I don't think he would have stopped. He would have stopped it. And I guess then my point is this: sending people to jail is a very powerful weapon. Judy Miller was in jail for 2 months and decided that she was going to make a deal that theoretically she had not been willing to make before. Now, she had her own reasons. She gave her own explanation for that. But I guess my point is that in the real world of real journalism, as you're talking about, the real world at that moment was that Katharine Graham didn't go to jail. But we may have been now moved into a different real world, and a real world in which prosecutors are going to be sending reporters to jail. Realistically, what can one expect of reporters who are facing, as Judy Miller was, a significant amount of jail time, the expectation that the special prosecutor was going to reconvene another grand jury and leave her in for another 18 months. Do you genuinely expect reporters under those kinds of pressures to go to jail?
As a last resort, I think there's no alternative. That hopefully you will find a way to keep yourself out of jail, to go to your source, to see if there's some way not to go to jail and not abrogate your pledge of confidentiality. That one of the problems is that I think there's an aspect of the so-called Plame investigation that hasn't been looked at enough. It seems to me that the really significant thing about what this investigation has done is it has shined a light on the disingenuousness, the lying, the willingness of this presidency to go after those who disagree with it and discredit them. It's shown a light on it that the administration and the White House and the president and the vice president and the people around them can't hide from. But it has little that they were able to hide from it when it was the press because they could take their agenda and move the press away from it very successfully. They can't keep this special prosecutor's investigation, they can't keep that searchlight away. But at the same time, what triggered this investigation, I think, is a really bad thing. What triggered it was some exchanges of information between reporters and sources of the kind that goes on all the time in Washington. That I don't believe for a minute that what triggered this investigation was really one of these guys sitting up there and saying, oh, let's say today that Valerie Plame was an undercover agent. I don't buy it. Why would they do it? I mean, they're often stupid, but I don't think they're that stupid. But so you
As
have...
John Wayne said, life is tough, but life is tougher if you're stupid.
But, so my point is that if we are going to go in, look, for me, the good news is finally something has kept the press's attention on the way this presidency and this president and his people operate. The bad news is that what it took to do it was going into reporters' back pockets.
Okay, so
Now,
Bob,
it is
yeah.
somebody who testified
Yes.
before Fitzgerald. What struck me is interesting that I did what a reporter does when I saw there was a piece of the puzzle missing the day Scooter Libby was indicted, realizing that someone had told me about this, that Mrs. Wilson was a weapons of mass destruction analyst, which is not an undercover position, but told me earlier than the prosecutor alleged. I did, you pick up the phone and you go see people, and went to my source and said, there's new information here. Here's what the transaction was between us. And this source said, I have to go to the prosecutor. I have to go to the prosecutor. I have to tell the truth. And so I said, we have a confidentiality agreement. Is it waived if you do that? And they come and ask me. And the source said yes. And in fact, wrote me a letter, not only saying that I could, but saying that I was requested to testify. And I, like Carl, very concerned about prosecutors going after reporters and their sources. It is a really bad thing for journalism, for the country. You will dry up the real story of what's going on in government. But as Fitzgerald said publicly the day he indicted Scooter Libby, he is not looking for a First Amendment showdown. And he demonstrated that with my lawyer they were able to work out an agreement where I would answer very narrow questions pertaining only to his investigation, and it would not stray into other areas beyond that. I was surprised. I mean, I think I even told you I was shocked that I was able to answer all the questions and it not intrude or infringe in any way into other sources. So, in a sense, for the,
Well, he did that with Miller, too. He actually did circumscribe it so that
But
she
he
did
called
not-
her to the grand jury and he asked her
Right.
questions that I did not have to deal with.
Right.
And that was
Yes.
very important. He got all the information he needed, and hopefully he'll be able to complete his investigation and we won't have that First Amendment showdown that clearly worries you and I think all
Well, this
journalists.
is a terrible precedent.
Well, I want to pursue, Bob, what you were talking about. You've been taking hits pretty much for the last couple of weeks. Yesterday, Frank Rich in the New York Times and others, about the arrangement that you have with the sources within the Bush administration, which is your way of doing your work. You make arrangements, generally of confidentiality, generally with very senior people, and
That's
you-
not true with low-level people, mid-level people, and
well,
senior
including,
people.
including very senior people.
Yes. Sure.
Frank Rich yesterday said you missed the story or you weren't looking for it in Plan of Attack.
Yeah.
When you go back and look at Plan of Attack, and now you know it's going to be in your new book that's underway now, do you feel that you missed something important that you're going to be going back now and saying, this is what was going on and this is what they were telling me, but this is what was really happening?
You know, they're facts. And the book, Plan of Attack, was about Bush's decision to go to war in great detail. And we went to war in March 2003. The book came out 13 months later, but the Valerie Plame issue and so forth has nothing to do with the decision to go to war, and that I was able to provide a microscopic look at. And what, I think it's kind of good to be in the arena and have people debate this and criticize it, but what is fascinating is people like Frank Rich don't read the book.
You don't have to be.
Yeah.
I can do this without being defensive because I didn't write the thing. And Frank is my friend, and I think he's 100% off base here. What he wrote was what remains unrecorded in Plan of Attack. And first of all, he talked about what was in Plan of Attack that so contributed to our understanding of this presidency. And I think it's very important to realize as a premise that what we know about the presidencies going back to Nixon, most of what we know about what's really important, we know from Woodward. I had something to do with the Nixon presidency, but after that, basically, Woodward's books provide the template on which we look at these other presidencies and what these presidents tried to keep hidden. And that's particularly true in the Bush presidency. Now, you might argue with Bob's methodology, whether it connects this dot or doesn't connect that dot, but nonetheless, if you're to look at Harry Reid's talking points and the Democrats' talking points of the last few weeks that are having such an effect in terms of showing how we went to war disingenuously and how a presidency lied to the Congress and the people of the United States, about half or three-quarters of their Democratic talking points come out of Plan of Attack. That's the first thing. But what remains unrecorded in Plan of Attack is any inkling of the disinformation campaign built to gin up this war, Frank wrote. And then there's a page 290 to 294, there's a whole section about Karen Hughes, one of the chief ginner-uppers. The president said, she said, wanted it to be like the old television series, Dragnet. Just the facts. Let people draw their own conclusions. See that? You didn't know I could do that deadpan, did you? But, you know, what do I know? I remember when I read Plan of Attack the first time, and I said to myself, well, what do I know from this book? And here's another one. Powell looked at it. 4 Mohammed Atta meetings in Prague. This was worse than ridiculous. This is to supposedly prove the connection between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein. I was in Iraq before the first Gulf War, and there's no connection.
And just to set the context for people, this is Cheney calling Powell, who's
Right.
going to make his presentation to the UN before the war, and says, look at these connections.
okay.
So
Well, let me just read,
listen,
I want to read this
okay,
one point. Powell looked at it. Powell thought that Cheney had the fever. The vice president and Wolfowitz kept looking for the connection between Saddam and 9/11. It was a separate little government out there. Wolfowitz, Libby, Faith's Gestapo office, as Powell privately called it. Now, even in the Democratic Congress, I haven't heard a lot of them call this place a Gestapo yet. But here in this book, they do.
Well, I take it that you're not critical of it.
No, in fact, no. Bob and I have critical discussions all the time about our respective methodologies, and they're very different. All I'm saying is there are many legitimate ways to do reporting and to do journalism, and this is certainly a valid one. And the way I do it is different, and it's valid.
Okay, well, okay. No,
so-
let me ask you, Bob. This is your portrait of the White House going to war. You know all that's in there. You know what's weighted more heavily. You know what the overall message you were trying to deliver is. I have no doubt that you could find many other paragraphs like you're talking about. But the question that I'm asking you is, when you are looking at this book from the vantage point of today, do you feel like this paints the portrait accurately, or is that going to have to, are we going to have to wait to your next book for that?
Well, first, yes, it paints it accurately, and it paints it in you know, look, we're caught in the issues of somebody who has a point of view reacting to this book. When the book came out last year, it was recommended on the Bush website and the John Kerry website, and I thought, that means the neutrality I have sought, I have achieved. And my wife Elsa, who is much better at these things, I remember looked and said, recommended by the Bush campaign and the Kerry campaign, can only mean one thing. No one has read the book. Perhaps a better explanation, but why would, as I say, chronology, when you write a book, you're trying to deal with a certain period. The most significant decision George Bush made, the one that defines him, and if I dare say, defines this country to the world, is the decision to go to war in Iraq. And in the tradition of the Washington Post, when Carl and I were doing Watergate or doing our second Watergate book, the Post said, take a year and find out what happened. And I was able, by having confidentiality relationships with people at all levels, I want to stress that. Some of the best sources in this book, you do not know who they are, and you perhaps, I hope, never will. And it provides a total universe portrait. I was able to get all the information. I write in the book. I condensed the timeline and the chronology to a 21-page memo. I sent it to George Bush. Colleagues at the Washington Post said, you sent a 21-page memo to George W. Bush? He never read anything that long at Yale. But he did read it. And I interviewed him over 2 days for 3.5 hours. And he answered all of the questions. And on record is the president giving his answer to what motivated him, how he responded, why he decided, and gives researchers at the Washington Post have looked at this, and as best we can tell, It is the longest interview a sitting president has ever given on a single subject.
As
It's a
usual,
de-
we disagree on this because I think the most important thing is not that what Bob is saying. I think the most important thing that Bush said in there is he didn't talk to his father before he went to war. Okay.
But I asked him that.
But interestingly
I asked
enough, to me, the most important thing in many ways I think that we've learned about George Bush is what he said to Woodward in response to that question. I didn't talk to my father about it, and I'm paraphrasing. I talked to a higher father about it. That is, to me, the most single revealing piece of information about this president that we have learned yet. I learned it in there. That's what I'm getting at.
Carl, do you believe that there was a concerted disinformation propaganda campaign to mislead Americans about that intelligence that got us into the war?
Yes, I
Do
think.
you believe that is represented in that book?
Yes, I think that there.
Bob, do you think that's represented in
You
that
know
book?
what? I mean, look. Here's the business, and this is where, over the decades, the friendship between the two of us has deepened. But we have different ways of looking at things, and my inclination is not to make a judgment because too often my judgments have been wrong. Simply want to try to find out what happened and put it out, and people can make their own judgments.
And I think sometimes you have to be a little more explicit.
Yeah.
I mean, is it? I mean, if
He does, and
but
he
I mean-
tells me, and I have to say you have a wonderful sniffer. You can sniff things out before lots of other people, certainly including myself. But I'm going to stick to my method.
We have different methodologies.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think you will find in there, in fact, there's a very direct quote, I can't remember, I'm trying to find it here, about the intelligence not being there. And what it talks about is, well, the fact that it's not there, and this is Rumsfeld talking, the fact that it's not there doesn't mean it might exist. That is the premise that is through this book.
This is Wolfowitz,
And-
Rumsfeld's
and-
deputy,
Carrying out the Rumsfeld rules.
saying he
me-
believed that just because there's no evidence of
doesn't mean
something
it's
mean
not
that
there.
that there isn't evidence somewhere.
but-
what about this?
That's
other
why I
question?
didn't go to law school.
What about the other thing that has been said more recently because of the Valerie Plame thing? When you guys were two Metro reporters on a story, as you know, the White House Correspondents Group poo-pooed it. They never got it. They never pursued it. The New York Times, I know, felt that they were totally misled by their White House reporting staff, who basically dismissed the whole thing. The best reporting, at least some think, in the run-up to the war was done by people like Knight Ridder.
Knight Ridder. It is said.
You, especially Bob, have now become the man who has more access to the highest, you're the most quintessential insider journalist that exists anywhere right now. At least that's certainly the way you're perceived, because you have the ability to get George Bush to sit down with you for 2 days at a time. Do you find that you've got to get this access through trimming sales when you are also the assistant managing editor of the Washington Post? You're going on television and talking about things that affect the image of the Bush administration and so forth. How do you balance those things?
By being honest and explaining what I have, and I don't trim my sails, and I think, as you know, Carl, and I could do a little reading after the forum tonight from the books. The toughest stuff about Bush is in there, and you set me up as
My
this.
piece is tougher.
Pardon?
My piece is tougher.
Okay, yeah, you're but on the Congress.
No, it's on Bush, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
okay.
okay, about Bush, yeah, but it's your conclusion, and what I'm saying
That was a
is
joke.
I want to explain simply what happened, and let me just give an example
Sure.
of the perils, I think, of judging. A month after Nixon resigned, back in 1974, you may remember this, Gerald Ford was president, and he went on television and announced a full pardon for Nixon. and I was asleep in a hotel room in New York City, and you called me up, and you were on fire that this had happened. And I was asleep, kind of, you woke me up, and you said, have you heard what happened? And I hadn't heard anything, and so forth. And Carl, then and now, has the ability to say in the fewest words with the most drama exactly what happened. And he said the following: "The son of a bitch pardoned the son of a bitch."
It's true.
Now, I'm slow, but even I understood what had happened.
But you know, it's interesting.
Now,
but
yeah,
well,
okay, go ahead.
You know, one of the things about reporting in all kinds of different venues, books, magazine articles, newspapers, that nonetheless, reporting is a snapshot. So at that moment, we had a snapshot of the son of a bitch pardoning the son of a bitch. I would say today that the pardon of Richard Nixon was a great thing, that it might have saved the country, that it was a brave act that cost Gerald Ford the presidency, but nonetheless the country was able to move on. It in no way in the end kept Nixon from being regarded as anything but what he was and known for what he had done. Might we have learned a tiny bit more if Nixon were in the dock for the next 3 years? Maybe a little, but it was the right thing to do.
And so the point there
But
is...
it's a snapshot of the moment.
Yeah, and in the snapshot of the moment, you know, the son of a bitch pardoned the son of a bitch. Now, I think you and I, over the decades, have changed our mind, and I said recently to Ford, I no longer think you're a son of a bitch. But I don't think we've changed our mind about the other guy.
That's right.
But so, you make, now look, after that pardon, we did a book about Nixon's last year in office, and we thought, and we had some evidence, that there was a deal, that it was part of the continuation of Watergate. Ford had promised the long national nightmare was over, and it looked like it was continuing. But when you examine it, and I had the chance 25 years later to go to Ford and set tape recorders down and say, what happened? Look at all the record, examine it, and realize exactly what Carl said, that it made all the sense in the world. Ford wanted his presidency, his own presidency, wanted to give the country something different other than Nixon being indicted, standing trial, going to jail, and so forth. So, what's the lesson learned? The lesson learned is I tend to withhold my judgments.
But you went on television, during the Valerie Plame, not the climactic moment, but you went on television at a time when it was important for you to have the goodwill of the Bush administration because of the book you're doing and because of the access. And I'm not saying you didn't believe what you said, but the idea of a conflict of interest is the appearance as much as the reality.
Sure, but what I said is I criticized the Fitzgerald investigation, I think in a lot of pent-up frustration, but as we now know, I knew something. And the idea that somebody should go on television and not base some conclusions or judgments on having information, I think is wrong. And so that's what I was trying to do in that situation. And I knew, because somebody had told me this in a casual, offhand way, it turns out, as I learned afterwards, much sooner than anyone else, and then I did the things reporters do. So I don't find anything mysterious about that.
If you know, as I think Carl says, and I think it's probably true, what you know is probably more than anybody about the Bush administration. Who better to make judgments about the Bush administration than Bob Woodward?
Yeah.
And not to make judgments, in a way, is essentially what you were talking about, it would seem. It lets things go unnoticed.
But first of all, let me answer one part of this, and that is what material you decide to put in a book or in a story is a judgment. The fact that you don't say, guilty, 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 he passed the salt, doesn't mean that what you've chosen doesn't portray somebody as guilty or show what's going on.
I'm not disagreeing with that.
Right.
But I
Yeah.
mean, my point is
But
still
you know,
there.
I'm old school about this, and we live in this soundbite culture, and every once, is it thumbs up, thumbs down? What's the conventional wisdom on a book, on a personality, on a life, on a presidency? I don't think you can reduce
Well,
it to that.
this is what I mean is this. For instance, in Plan of Attack, Carl was saying that what he took from Plan of Attack was one thing, and that your sort of vision of it was more neutral than that. The Republicans and the Democrats both liked the book. But if you believed that no matter what George Bush was saying, and no matter what Dick Cheney was saying, that what was actually happening was not the same thing, would you have said so?
Look, I have in the book, let me give you an example.
Okay.
Show in detail how in January 2003, a couple of months before the war started, President Bush decided to go to war. He told Cheney, he told Powell in a very vivid confrontation scene. He told Rumsfeld, he told Karl Rove, he told Condi Rice. I have the scenes, the dates, the conversations. I asked Bush about this. Then the president 2 months later, 2 weeks before the war, has a live press conference and says, I haven't decided to go to war. He says it in a kind of, I haven't decided if we are going to war or something like that, but it's clear he's saying no decision has been made. And I say in a sentence, Rove, Rice, Powell, Rumsfeld knew otherwise. Anyone reading the book realizes that something has happened that's not the full story. The conventions of daily journalism, and Carl's out of them, and I think that's good, and I'm still in them, is you don't then, for instance, in the newspaper, if there's a clear contradiction, we will say, you know this from your New York Times days, in an apparent contradiction. We don't say guilty, 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 liar, liar, liar. But the message is conveyed. Now, in this case about deciding to go to war, I asked Bush about it, and I quote him at length about how tough it was and how he felt conflicted, and you get his perspective on what is an obvious contradiction.
Did you say, Mr. President, in all due respect, you said that you had not decided when in fact you had?
Yes.
And what did he say to that?
Well, you want Carl quoted from the book. I can't. He told me.
Okay. Let me ask you.
I mean, it's revealing what he said, and
my father told me.
No, it wasn't the father told me.
No, but again, there are two ways of doing that. It's laid out there. Then, I guess what I do more, because I don't work for the daily paper, I write different kinds of books, is maybe what I do is a little more of, say, what Izzy I.F. Stone would do. I take information I find out, I take other sources of information, including what Bob has written there, and then I put that together, but I don't have the same strictures on me. I don't work for the Washington Post. I can put it in Vanity Fair as I did. And then I say, this is what it means. And I said very early what I thought this stuff meant, based in large measure on this book, on things like Gonzales formulating regulations and giving them straight to the president that permit torture, while the White House says we don't torture. And even today, Condoleezza Rice is out there saying we don't really send people to torture camps.
Let me ask you a question. I don't want to ask him. Do you think he's been taking unfair hits, and why do you think so?
Yeah.
Why do you think?
I think because people are furious, anguished about this war, that they know that we were taken into it by a president and people in his presidency who wanted to go to war, that used 9/11 as an excuse to go to war, that routinely lie in a way that few presidents or members of any administration have lied, and not just about the war, and that in a Nixonian way, They go after their enemies. And what the Fitzgerald investigation did is it showed for so many people, because this White House had said, nobody here is involved. That's different than what Fitzgerald is out to do legally. But the fact is, these people were involved. Once again, they used
So
slippery
why Bob
words.
Woodward? Why Bob Woodward?
Because he's the messenger. And also, I don't want to get into the question of Schadenfreude, this year's word. But look, I read an editorial in the Norwich, Connecticut newspaper the other day. I believe it was Norwich, about why the Post should fire Woodward. And I'm thinking to myself about all the big stories I've read broken in this newspaper in Connecticut. And, and I'm saying to myself, what is going on here? I mean, it's like journalists eat their young and
Well,
they're
you know,
old.
There's another
But wait a minute, I'm serious.
Now, that's a good newspaper, the Norwich,
That's right.
whatever.
Right. But my point is, look, I wrote in 1992 a cover story for the New Republic magazine called The Idiot Culture, about where journalism was going: gossip, sensationalism, manufactured controversy. It's mild by today's standards, what I wrote back then, but it was a little prophetic, perhaps. And those are the real problems in our profession today, not Woodward in the Washington Post. That's not the real problem in our profession.
Okay, now that's a good, I appreciate that, and I know that's said with affection. Look, I can deal with it. I am going about my business trying to find out what happened. In this case, I inserted myself. I could have just sat on my hands and said, oh, there's a contradiction, I know something. Instead, I have to say this is something I learned from Carl during Watergate. You act, you pick up the phone, you go talk to somebody, you probe, you stir things up, and so in stirring things up, I then become the subject. That's okay. That's good. It will bear the most detailed scrutiny.
Have any of the things that have been written critically of you stuck to you? Any things that have hit home as far as you're concerned?
Okay, let me just compare it to, what you're asking me is about doubt. And in our business, we live on doubt. We always are re-examining what other people do. You have to re-examine what you do. I have asked George Bush about doubt, and he jumps in his chair in the Oval Office and says, I have no doubt. Now, I find that...
I rest my case.
Okay, but look, it is possible for somebody to not have doubt. He insists he jumps in his chair in a way that even you don't jump in your chair defending me. He just is... it's part of his being, and he will even say, and he said, I know it's hard to believe, but I don't have doubt. And so I live in a world of doubt. I look at everything I do. I try to be critical. I think Carl is hit on something about the war. The war is at the emotional center of where this country is. It is a big deal. It should be a big deal. I write in the book where I had 3 sources before the war who told me that the intelligence on weapons of mass destruction was much skimpier and weaker than was being said. I proposed writing a story with a colleague at the Post, took it to the national security editor at the Post, and they thought it was too strong. And I say this in the book, and I feel this very, very strongly. I didn't do what a reporter should do. If Carl had been there, we would have been in Len Downey's office saying, we've got to write this story. We have to find out more information. Failing
We
on my
all
part.
make mistakes of news judgment, and especially in terms of how much weight should something get. The one thing I would say, if I were writing that book, the one thing I know that I would put in it, I would write about George Bush's military service, and I would write about Dick Cheney's deferments. I think that's a relevant factor. Bob doesn't write about it in there. I would do it that way. I think it's part of the story. But those are all relative
Maybe we could
considerations.
we could team up a plan of attack revisit.
That's right. But no, all those are, again, it's back to questions of news judgment.
Well, the thing is that your new book, when is it going to be published, do you think?
A day later, because we're here.
Yeah.
2 days after tonight's storm.
Is it going to be, aren't you going to have to go back and revisit the pre-war era and actually do a plan of attack return to?
I can't give you a preview of the book because I've got lots of new information, and it ostensibly is about Bush's second term, and of course all of this happened in the first term, but when we did Watergate, we found you had to go back to the beginning. So I'm more
But the
than
second term
happy-
is about how we got into the war. I mean, it's turning in to be about that.
Some of it is, and I'm open to new information, and anyone who has information can reach me at the Washington Post, woodwardb@washpost.com.
I want to open it up to questions from students. If you would please go to the microphones here, there, here, and up there. A question, please, and not a speech. And we'll start with you, sir.
Thank you. I'm Raul Prabhakar. I'm a student at the college, and it's an honor to see you, Mr. Woodward and Mr. Bernstein. And my question does refer back to Mr. Rich's column from yesterday, where he seemed to imply that you were manipulated, essentially, by Bush officials, Mr. Woodward, in the build-up to the Iraq War, and that somehow you don't understand the implications of the CIA leak scandal because of that. And that somehow your top-level access somehow diminishes your journalistic integrity. What's your response to that?
First of all, I don't think he read the book very carefully. And if he did, he wouldn't make the assertions like Carl quoted. And he assumes, and he didn't call me, and I would have been happy to answer his questions, that he somehow suggests that I was dragged into this as an unwilling participant. I put myself in this for the following reasons. You take action as a reporter to try to shed light on what occurred. And I watched the Fitzgerald press conference, and I knew something that I thought was relevant. I'm not going to run to the prosecutor. What I did is run to sources. And it's disturbing that somebody at the New York Times is not interested in the facts. I would never write about somebody and draw sweeping conclusions without trying to talk to them. And that's just journalism 101, even for a columnist.
Yes, sir.
Except for Novak.
Ma'am? Sorry.
Except for Novak.
Do you think that
Could you
based
identify
on...
yourself? Could you identify yourself?
My name is Ben. My name is Ben Miller from F.A. Day Middle School in Newton, Massachusetts.
Great.
Based on the political climates today with the Fitzgerald investigation, Judith Miller having been sent to jail, do you think that if something like Watergate broke today involving the Bush administration, it would be possible to cover it because of the, new precedents on keeping confidential sources confidential?
Really good question. I think that you have to go back to the situation at the beginning of Watergate when very few institutions, only the Washington Post and Time Magazine really at the beginning, and then the New York Times a little bit, were willing to commit the resources necessary to the story to get it. And I think that same situation existed today with the Bush presidency. Getting deep, which are what books like this do, and today we have far better reporting in books, incidentally, not just Woodward's, than we do in daily newspapers too often. And I think today we're finally seeing a cover-up unravel in the Bush White House. And that cover-up, which is really what happened in Watergate, is the cover-up led to what became known as the White House horrors, all the other things that the White House had done, that Nixon had done, became revealed because of this third-rate burglary. I think what's happening now is that the methodology, the disingenuousness, and the willingness to attack opponents in a truly Nixonian way by this presidency are being exposed because a cover-up is being exposed. So I think it is, in a little different way, happening again. I think that there are great reporters in Washington who would protect their sources the same way we did. I think that this particular presidency is even more difficult to penetrate, including for Bob, than the Nixon presidency.
What about the legal climate?
I think, the legal climate at the time of Watergate was a nightmare. The legal climate at the time of Watergate was that the Justice Department, under the Attorney General of the United States, who was also Nixon's campaign manager, was trying to take away the television licenses of the Washington Post company, which were really at that time the lifeblood and the real source of income for the Post.
Can I just, real quickly, I don't, the issue of what's going on in the Bush administration is something we are going to find out about.
Yeah.
I think the problem, whatever it is, and I'm gonna not associate myself with your judgments, as you might understand. What I find difficult, and this is something Carl has always helped me with, what's the story? What's the issue here? It's the war, but I think one of the parts which I'm really frustrated with, we're not addressing the issue of the intelligence problem in this country. The weapons of mass destruction error was one of the most serious errors the CIA and the other intelligence agencies have ever made. And it was a doozy. I mean, they had convinced themselves and everyone in a very dramatic way that there was a threat out there. Now, the intelligence agencies have to address that. And what's happened, there have been investigations and commissions, and they say, oh, let's reorganize, and we have a director of national intelligence and so forth. Anyone who knows anything about any organization realizes that you fix it not at the top, but at the middle. The middle managers, the field people have to be good, have to have the right incentives, and there's not enough of that. And so in chasing down some of these things, we may miss the really important story. If there's a terrorist attack of great magnitude in this country, people are going to be saying, like you were going to say, where were you on the intelligence problem? What work were you doing? That's a real serious issue.
Fair enough. Yes, sir.
Why did Watergate have to occur? Is there any way? Is there any way in which it could have been avoided?
Is there any way this could be
sorry?
avoided? The war?
No, Watergate.
Watergate.
Why did Watergate?
Is there any way
Watergate have
Watergate?
to happen? Is there any way in which it could have been avoided?
Perhaps with a different mindset in the President of the United States. You had a President of the United States who didn't trust the institutions of government, who didn't trust the Constitution, who believed that he had to get even with his enemies, who really had no feeling for the people of the country. That really, it was all about him. So there was, in retrospect, there was a kind of inevitability about Watergate, given the character and personality of Nixon.
Yes, one more. No, sir, one to a customer, sorry.
Hi, my name is Benjamin Bolger, and I'm a grad student at Harvard. And some presidents have frequent press conferences, and other administrations choose to have infrequent press conferences. And I was wondering, since you've both had the chance to cover a number of presidents, if you could assess the real value of direct confrontation between the press and the president itself.
I think there should be many more press conferences. I think it's good for everyone. At the same time, it's no substitute for real reporting, going out, talking to dozens of people, trying to piece together what's really going on. But you know, they're good. You get to see the president, but don't get this idea that somehow all truth is going to flow from a presidential press conference.
You know, I was really lucky as a copy boy. I went to almost all of Jack Kennedy's press conferences at the State Department. I would run back texts to the office at the Washington Star. And I've been to subsequent press conferences a couple times, and I'll watch them on television. And Bob is right. You know, they're not really designed for learning facts. But, you know, I think about Kennedy at those press conferences, and I compare the level of sophistication about the world or knowledge of a given subject with other presidents or with this president, and that tells you an awful lot. And it's the one look that we get at a president on his feet and how his mind works in real time.
Yeah.
Here.
Hi, Kate Towell, Denebola Newspaper, Newton South High School, Newton, Massachusetts. I was just wondering what you both thought that younger generations born after the Nixon administration should take away from both the journalistic integrity and the reporting shown during the Watergate scandal.
You know, we over the summer we saw All the President's Men, the movie version of our book uncovering Watergate in New York City, and I hadn't seen it for 25 years.
Me neither.
And I took my 9-year-old daughter, Diana, and after it was over, I said, "What did you think?" And she said, because she's from Washington, she talks like a policy wonk. And so she said, "A." And then she really stuck it to me. She said, "The guy playing you doesn't look like you at all." And then B. Boring, boring, boring. Now, we watch. My watching of that movie, the lesson is night work. All the President's Men takes place at night. That you go out to people's homes, or you go, if some source will meet you in an underground garage, you go together, you go alone. We were night urchins.
And we were single.
And we were single.
And nobody keeping us home.
And you couldn't get a date.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, there's can I divert
Sure.
to this story? A story during the coverage of Watergate. We're there one night, and you came over, and there was a typed note in the carriage of your typewriter, and it just said,
You all know what a typewriter is.
Yes, right.
Everybody knows what that is,
Yes,
right?
that's right. There are people who don't. They're pre-computer. And it was a typed note, and it said, "Bernstein, watch yourself. You went too far last night." And we thought, somebody from the Nixon White House came up the elevator, and we are now important enough to be threatened. We were delighted, and we puffed up our chest and conducted a big investigation to see, Haldeman, Ehrlichman had sent this over. And we turned out not Haldeman or Ehrlichman or anyone from the Nixon White House, and it was somebody else who figured it out. The very threatening Bernstein, watch yourself, you went too far last night, came from a copy girl that Carl was dating.
Up here.
Hello, my name is Kiana Shute, and I'm a broadcast journalism major at Boston University. And we have actually been talking about the use of anonymous sources all semester. And so I have 3 questions for you. The first question is, in today's news media, do you think that the use of anonymous sources is overused?
Say all 3.
Yeah.
Okay. And number 3 is...
You're getting a pass.
No, I mean,
Okay. And then a yes or no question, is there any time at all that you reveal the identity of your source? I know you answered that, but maybe like in a yes or no. And also, during your investigation with Mark Felt as your whistleblower, was there any time that you distrusted what he said or thought that he had an agenda?
Good question.
Yeah, the last question is very good. You always distrust what sources say, not in the sense of being hostile about it, but you check it. And we, thank God, had the good fortune to have the time and the nights to go out and talk to all kinds of people at all levels. And people like to say, oh, it was all low level or mid level and no high level. There were some high level sources. Mark Felt was number 2. In the FBI, but it was the mix.
And also, I didn't trust a lot of information that was coming into the FBI. And in fact, knowing that Felt was in the FBI made me doubt some of it. One other thing about the previous question as well is that I think for a young journalist, the most important thing is to learn to be a good listener and let people talk. That reporters generally are terrible listeners. People have a story to tell if you let them tell it. It might be truthful, it might not be truthful, it might be self-serving, it might not be self-serving. But if you let them tell it and you don't come in as saying, well, what'd you take out of the safe as your first question, you're going to learn something. And it's done less and less. And I would dare say that, when we did the final days is really when we learned that. Sit down and spend a lot of time with the people you're covering.
yes, sir, up here.
My name is Robert Chu. We're facing 3 more years of W. What's the chance of impeachment?
Carl? Well, I know that a judgment will not...
This is what Carl, 18 months ago, and this is where I say he has a good sniffer, in a piece in USA Today, talked about the lesson of Watergate, which, interestingly enough, for the Congress, for the political system, is Nixon had to resign not because of the media or the Democrats, he had to resign because of the courage of the Republicans, best exemplified by Barry Goldwater, who said in so many words to Nixon, too many crimes, too many lies. And what you say in this piece, which I have to say, came early, but you started talking about where are the Republicans? Where are the people in the party standing up, particularly on the torture issue? Well, this was 18 months ago. Now, John McCain, John Warner, of all people, Lindsey Graham, members of the Republican Party are saying, no, wait a minute. They are staring down Dick Cheney on this issue in a very, very aggressive way. So the political system has its bipolarity, but it also hits you most effectively when people within the party say, no more.
Can I ask you, Bob, to make a judgment about whether George W. Bush and Richard Nixon are comparable in their vulnerability to being impeached in the character sense?
In the character sense? I mean, look, here's the one thing which strikes me about Bush when I send in those 21 pages of questions and chronology. He will sit with me for, in a practical sense, no time limit, no limit of questions, no limit of questions. I asked 500 questions, in that 3.5 hours. Somebody said if I'd interviewed Clinton, I would have asked 4 questions. But Bush, 500. He would allow this. Now, it will be interesting to see, is he willing to continue in the atmosphere we're in? And
Well, there's another question. I think that what we're, let me just read something I wrote in this piece. I said that today, confronted by the graphic horrors of Abu Ghraib prison, by ginned-up intelligence to justify war, by 652 American deaths since presidential operatives declared mission accomplished, Republican leaders have yet to suggest that George W. Bush be held responsible for the disaster in Iraq and that perhaps he, not just Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, is ill-suited for his job. Now, what I was trying to get at there, that there is
and
a
what's
new,
interesting, 652 deaths, it's now 2,000.
2,200.
Yeah.
But what interests me and what interested me then is the question that we've never had to face, which is very different than the Nixonian character, and that is the question of whether we have a president who may not be competent. And that is a really serious question. And I suspect and hope it'll be one that Bob will look at in this next book. That I don't know what the answer is.
This is my assignment, editor.
Incidentally, I don't know the answer. And let me tell you, when George Bush was named president by the Supreme Court, I was on the air, on the network, and the decision came down, and they switched to me, and they said, well, what kind of president do you think he's going to be? And I said, look, everybody talks about how stupid he is or something. I don't buy it. This is a very smart man. I was wrong. But my point is, so I might not be right about the competence question either, but we need to address it because clearly that is a real issue here. How did this happen? How could this happen if we have a competent president?
What about the comparison of Cheney and Nixon?
I think, and again, it's in here, clear as can be. Powell thought that Cheney had the fever. To me, that says what I know from talking to other people in Washington. People who knew Dick Cheney in the Ford administration. Republicans as well as Democrats. There are many of them who will tell you they don't understand him. They think that he is half around the bend in one way or another, that he is not dealing responsibly. Colin Powell. And incidentally, there's one other thing in this book. It's clear to me. That is that Colin Powell is the one man who was in a position perhaps to stop this war and did not take the opportunity to do it by resigning.
Okay, that's interesting.
Okay.
No, I mean, those are, what's nice is you can deal with all of these questions and you can try to answer them and you can try to give people information. And Carl and I differ in our approaches, sometimes significantly, but it was Katharine Graham who was the publisher and owner of the Washington Post. I remember over one lunch asked, when are we going to find, and this is early on in Watergate when we were under, no one believed us, the TV licenses were being challenged. The Washington Post is a credible institution, journalistically and as a business enterprise was in peril. And she asked, when's the whole story going to come out? And I said, Carl and I felt, because Nixon was good at compartmentalizing information, scaring people in the White House. After all, we believed it was a criminal conspiracy. The answer was never. And she sat there with a pained look on her face and said the following, never, don't tell me never. Now that was not a threat. That's a statement of purpose.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Carolina Drianska. I'm a first-year student at the Kennedy School. In which circumstances do you think reporters have an obligation to keep the information revealed to them that's sensitive by sources to themselves?
You mean not report it?
Yeah.
I mean, the ultimate is you report it if it's significant or meaningful, and if you can confirm it. But sometimes things like the information I got on the Valerie Plame thing, it was conveyed in a way that was very gossipy and not suggested that it was conspiratorial, sensitive, or classified or secret.
I'll give you an example. That I went to Iraq before the first Gulf War, a few months before, and primary reason I was there really try to get an interview with Saddam Hussein. And they kept saying I was going to get it, and of course I didn't. So each day I'd go out and I'd talk to people, and after 3 weeks of this,
Can you imagine Saddam Hussein sitting down with you?
Right, we'll talk about Judaism. So finally, I talked to all these people who talked about how much people themselves and others in the country hated him. And the common wisdom in the United States at the time was that, you know, all these Iraqis were going to go out in the streets and cut off the American army's hands, and they were going to fight for Saddam. Meanwhile, everybody was telling me they had a cousin or a brother or a father who died in Iran. And the man was absolutely hated. So finally, I thought, you know, people ought to know this. I wrote the story for Time magazine, and I was put on the first plane to Cairo by Saddam Hussein, which was fine with me. But my point is, there does come a time, I think, when you are required to publish information if it is of interest, concern, and relevance. Now, in terms of a book, if you're trying to put a whole story together, you know, one of the things we did in Watergate, we published a couple hundred individual stories. Then we did a book, and during that period, we published no stories in the paper. They were very different. One was an attempt to explain in a detailed, nuanced way what had happened. The other was to take the story and day by day report what was going on. Again, they're both valid, but if you come across a piece of information that is relevant to what is going on at the present, I think you do have to publish.
We'll take two more. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Lior Galil. I'm a sophomore at Brandeis University. Mr. Woodward, you said how when you find out some information, you have to act, you have to talk to someone. And regarding the Valerie Plame case, there was an article in the Washington Post last week that's titled "The Man with Inside Scoop," all about you. And it said that you would decline to interview with them several times, even though accepting interviews with The Village Voice and Larry King on CNN. Correct me if I'm wrong here. But why would you do that when it's easily in your best interest to interview with the paper that you work for when so many people...
Because it was Howie Kurtz, who's our media reporter, who's incredibly aggressive, and I'd spent hours with him on other stories. And he was doing an evaluation of my books and my work, and I said, Howie, it's all available. Carl knows, I mean, Howie Kurtz, if you're the subject of something in the media news, he wants to interview you 5 times a day. It was just a practical, it was not shunning my own paper, and he quoted me extensively in other articles.
But Lynn Downey sat down with him.
What?
Lynn Downey
I
sat
did
down.
too, I did. I did for the first 2 or 3 days. Howie Kurtz is a very dogged reporter, and there is a point where you're just going to say, look, he was trying to, as I say, look at my work, and I said, look at my work, Howie. So.
Yes, sir, up here.
Hi, my name's Andrew Miller. I'm a student in the college. Is the current trend towards sensationalist media that intensifies the voices of shrill, polarizing figures reversible? If so, how is that trend reversible? And also, what do you see the role of the internet media playing in either causing or helping to fix the problem, potentially?
I wish. I think the biggest, as I said earlier, problems in journalism today are sensationalism, manufactured controversy, which you're talking about, lack of context, lack of seriousness. And I think there's a huge problem because the bottom line in most of our journalism today, unlike when I went into the business 45 years ago.
The Coolidge administration.
That's right, the Coolidge administration. The bottom line today is the bottom line, not the best obtainable version of the truth. There are still a few independently owned newspapers where that is not the case. But increasingly, news institutions are not willing to put their stockholders at risk by investing in the kind of reporting that costs money. So is it going to be reversed? I don't think so. I'm really not optimistic. At the same time, I think that the web both offers great hope because hopefully younger people will read news, and they're not reading it in the newspaper today. And at the same time, too much of what is passing as journalism and reporting on the web is really straight off the grassy knoll. A phrase I told to Tina Brown the other day, and she put it in her piece and didn't give me credit. But
do they know what the grassy knoll is?
Right, the grassy knoll refers to the Kennedy assassination and the 5 shots that were allegedly fired from there, thereby proving a conspiracy. But what I'm getting at is, having read, it is really understandable why people are enraged at this war. But the necessity to go to a conspiracy of the press and particular reporters as what's happened here. Nixon made the conduct of the press the issue in Watergate, specifically our conduct, instead of the president and his men. And right now, too many people on the web are making the conduct of the press, our conduct or Bob's conduct, the issue instead of the conduct of the president.
But what defines, I mean, and it's a very good question, the characteristics of the media environment we live in and work in now are impatience and speed. And this, get it out quick, who cares? And on the internet, I mean, look, it's a problem. We got to face it. Somebody can say anything about anyone. And believe me, they do. And somebody's got to come out with some way of giving at least people a roadmap and saying, this it has reporting standards, this does not, because you go and you Google somebody or you Google something, and who knows what's going to pop out of the...
We need a mainstream press in this country, even if it's only 5 newspapers in one network, but we need a really good mainstream press with some standards. And without it, we're going to devolve into this name-calling and chaos completely. And at the same time, one of the great things about the internet is that when the mainstream press gets lazy, people in the on the web find out about it and publish it and hold their feet to the fire sometimes.
Yeah. Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein, thank you very much. Thank you. Those of you, I know that there are some of you here who are working for news organizations. We don't allow news organizations to ask questions during the program, but Bob and Carl have said that they would be willing to meet with you if you have some particular questions that you'd like to ask them.
If you can run as fast as we can.
Thanks, guys. That was terrific.
You did a good job. Hey, my God, look at this.